birds, bats, bees, butterflies, moths, and beetles. Without them, we would have difficulty feeding ourselves. Carolyn Henne has over 20 years experience planting and providing guidance to landowners throughout Michigan in her role as a botanist for the Oakland and Macomb conservation districts on her own property and as a botanist for Manistee National Forest. Today, Carolyn will talk about the habitat needs of pollinators. She will explain how to transition your property into beneficial habitat that enhances the landscape with color and warmth. So let's get going with Carolyn, and I'll get out of the way. Thanks, Carolyn.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks for that introduction. So good evening, everybody. As Joe said, I am a botanist for the Manistee National Forest, and I've worked there since 2003. So Joe asked me to talk about planting for pollinators, which involves two of my favorite things to talk about, native plants and pollinators. And I would really like this to be a good discussion rather than a formal presentation. So please, if you have any questions or need any clarification, just unmute and let me know. So I'm going to start by going over some basic information before getting into the nitty-gritty of how to plant habitat for pollinators. So pollinators have been in the news quite a bit over the past couple of years. But what exactly are pollinators? So pollinators are any animal that moves pollen from one flower to another. Most people think of bumblebees or monarchs when they hear the word pollinator. But as Joe said, beetles, flies, moths, skippers, ants, and hummingbirds are all important pollinators in our area. And in different regions, there are bats, monkeys, and even other small animals that are critical for pollination. So why are pollinators so important? To put it bluntly, life on Earth, without pollinators, life on Earth would cease to exist as we know it. Neither pollinators nor plants can survive without each other. If one of them should disappear, the other would probably be one generation away from either being eliminated or having really reduced population levels. So, pollinators are necessary for plants to produce seeds. Seeds produce the next generation of plants, provide provide food for the next generation of pollinators, and back and forth and back and forth. So if this cycle were disrupted, it would have a pretty huge impact on our planet. Over 80% of the plants on Earth require a pollinator to reproduce. That's over 180,000 species of plants that need pollinators in order to produce seeds. Over 1,200 of our crops need pollinators in order to reproduce. That's over 2/3 of our crops need pollination services to produce fruits, vegetables, nuts, coffee, chocolate. Even meat and dairy products rely on pollination kind of indirectly because cows and other livestock are fed hay, which requires pollination by insects. So about 1/3 of the food that we eat or drink results from the services of pollinators. And not only that, but about half of all of our oils, fibers, and raw materials also rely on pollination and the service of pollinators. So losing pollinators could really change the world that we live in. So why are pollinators, oops, sorry about that, I forgot about this slide. So this was an interesting demonstration that Whole Foods did. They basically, they took a picture. Just out of curiosity, can you see my arrow when I'm moving over the picture? Thank you. So they went through their store and removed anything off the shelves that depended on bees to be produced. So if you look in that bottom right-hand corner, you can see that our options would be dramatically reduced. And the loss of pollinators would have a similar impact on the food supplies for animals that eat plants, seeds, fruits, pollinators, or the creatures that eat any of these things. So losing pollinators would be critical for us, but it would be really devastating for wildlife and the ecology of our natural systems. So why are pollinators disappearing? Lots of different reasons. Habitat loss, habitat degradation, habitat fragmentation, pesticide use, introduction of diseases and parasites, climate change, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we could spend the rest of the evening talking about any one of these issues, but I would really rather focus on solutions. So what can we as private landowners do to help pollinators? Well, it turns out that we can do a lot. If you look at a map of the ownership in Michigan, the vast majority of land, about 75%, is privately owned. Basically, all the white space on this map is private land. The areas that are in green or this yellow or pink, those are managed by either state or federal agencies. And so when I look at this map, it looks like there's a lot of federal land and there's a lot of state land, but it's very fragmented. But if you look at the private land ownership, it's pretty contiguous. So if all of the private landowners worked together, if we all did a little bit to pitch in and provide habitat for pollinators, we could provide a lot of habitat for them. Butterflies are not, and bees and hummingbirds and all the other pollinators, they're not restricted by property lines. They flit from flower to flower, from yard to yard. They can go wherever they want. They're not restricted by those private property lines. So how do we go about providing that habitat for the pollinators? By planting native plants. And excuse me for just a minute, I'm gonna get a drink of water. Having worked at home for the past 6 months, I don't talk that much anymore. And so I just need to keep drinking water or I'll lose my voice by the end of this. So forgive me for just a second. So what are native plants? The way I'm going to use that phrase tonight, I'm referring to plants that naturally occur in Michigan and are of Michigan genotype. And that's a pretty strict interpretation of that phrase. So why do I use such a strict definition of native plants for my pollinator plantings and habitat restoration work? For a few different reasons. If you look at this range map for butterfly milkweed, it grows across most of the United States and quite a bit of Canada. And if you think about the climate of California, Texas, Florida, the plants that are adapted to living in those areas are not going to be very well adapted to living in Michigan. So one of the reasons why I prefer to use plants that have Michigan genotypes is that they are adapted to the climate in our state. So there are also these maps of seed exchange zones where scientists have put together all sorts of models. And these are the areas like in this, this bright reddish color. Those are the areas that they believe seed can be transferred around in and will survive well because they have about the same climatic conditions, the same high temperatures, the same low temperatures, the same number of days of below zero temperatures, et cetera, et cetera. But that's all based on climatic data. It's not necessarily taking into consideration the soil types or the soil biota, like the mycorrhizal fungi. Our native plants have very close relationships with specific species of those mycorrhizal fungi. The native plants really rely on those mycorrhizal fungi. They get water and nutrients from the fungi. The fungi get carbohydrates from the plants. If those species have developed, or if those plants have developed relationships with different species of mycorrhizal fungi in different regions, and then they're suddenly planted in Michigan and those mycorrhizal fungi species aren't here, those plants are going to be more susceptible to drought, to stress, to predators, to lots of different things, lots of different stressors. So that is another reason why I think it's important for us to be planting those Michigan genotypes. So another reason why I prefer to use those Michigan genotypes is because it turns out that insects are really fussy eaters. About 90% of insects are considered specialists in that they only feed on one or two closely related lineages of plants. So our most famous or well-known examples of that are milkweeds and monarch butterflies. So the monarch caterpillars can only eat the milkweed plants. Why is that? Why is it that most of our insects are such fussy eaters? Why is it that they only feed on those closely related plants? Well, if you think about it, plants can't really run away from the things that want to eat them. So they have developed a lot of different defenses. You know, they're the thorns of the different raspberry and blackberry species. You know, with the hairy cocoon, you can see all the hairs on the leaves, and that's to deter other things from eating them. This wintergreen has a very waxy coating on its leaves. They're all developed to prevent insects and other animals from eating them. In addition to that, most plants have developed toxins or poisons to keep animals from eating them. So this white milky sap from the milkweeds is full of a toxin called cardiac glycoside, which is poisonous for most insects, but monarch caterpillars and a few other insects have adapted to being able to eat them. So one of the trade-offs of adapting to be able to eat milkweeds is that those species can't tolerate the toxins produced by other plants. And that same thing is happening with all of those other, not insects, that 90% of insects. Their systems have adapted to being able to tolerate one or two or a few different kinds of plant toxins, but that's it. So that's why they are so restricted in their diets. So my concern is that also that if plants are brought in from other areas of the country, even if it's the same species, they may have developed slightly different defense chemicals to prevent their local predators from eating them. So that might make them toxic or unpalatable for our local insects. So if we're trying to provide habitat and a food source for our local pollinators, it seems like we should really be using our local plants as well. So you might be asking yourself right now what eating plants has to do with pollinators. Don't they just eat nectar and pollen from the flowers? So in the case of bees and hummingbirds, that would be accurate. But the caterpillars of moths, butterflies, and skippers eat plants. So it's important to provide food sources for those caterpillars if you also want to have the butterflies, moths, and skippers. So let's see. Uh-oh. There we go. So just a few other reasons for using native plants. Doug Tallamy, who wrote the book Bringing Nature Home, has done a lot of research. And one of the things that he and his grad students have discovered is that pollinators prefer the pollen and nectar of native plants 4-to-1 over non-native plants. So even though butterflies, moths, caterpillars, bees aren't necessarily as restricted in their diet as the caterpillars are, they tend to visit many more species of plants, but they still prefer those native plants 4-to-1 over non-native plants. And then, when you go to the nurseries, there are a lot of really cool looking plants out there. But modern hybrids, especially the double flowers that look so neat, tend to lose their nectar, pollen, and scent during the cultivation process. Since the pollinators are visiting the flowers to obtain that energy-rich nectar and protein-rich pollen, if the flowers aren't producing them, they really aren't valuable for the pollinators.
Carolyn?
Yeah.
What do you mean by doubled blossoms? What does that mean?
So if you went back and looked at the wild roses, they basically just have one layer of petals in our area. But the double flowers are going to have lots of extra petals compared to their wild or native origins. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so with that, then it reduces the amount of available food for the pollinators because the petals are taking up that energy or something?
It's more that they're not producing the nectar and pollen anymore.
Oh.
I'm not sure how it happens, but just in that cultivation process, those things aren't as important as the appearance of the plant anymore, and they're just kind of lost in the process.
So avoid hybrids.
Right? Cultivar stands for cultivated variety. So that means that it has been bred for a specific purpose. And usually that purpose is the appearance of the plant and not necessarily its usefulness to insects. If anything, they're trying to discourage insects from eating those plants. When you go to the greenhouses, a lot of the plants will say that they're pest resistant and different things because they have been developed specifically to reduce the damage caused by insects, if that makes sense. Okay. So let's see here. Okay. So another reason why I prefer to use the native plants is because they are so much more valuable to the caterpillars. So Doug Tallamy did research also that demonstrated that native plants produce about 35 times as many caterpillars as non-native plants. Not all native plants are at that beneficial for insects and pollinators. Like if you look at our oaks and cherry trees and what have you, they are the host plants for 400, 500 species. So this is, and I'm sorry that I couldn't make this larger for you, but you can go back and look at this when this presentation is done also. But with oaks, the number of species of caterpillars that they support, it's 557. So if you are not the gardening type, if you don't want to plant a flower bed, then planting oaks, cherries, willows, birches, aspen, crab apples, maples, those are all super beneficial for lots of different pollinators who rely on them as host plants for their caterpillars. And I'm not saying that, the summer sweet and bush and stuff like that aren't supporting as many species aren't important because they might be supporting very specialist species. So yeah, planting and landscaping with native species is just a really fantastic way that we can help out our pollinators. And not only the pollinators, but all the things that rely on those pollinators as well. Okay, so how do you incorporate native plants into your landscape? Well, there are lots of different ways that you can do that. You know, as I mentioned, you can plant native trees in your yard. You can plant native grasses into your existing gardens, which is what I've been doing at my house. You know, I have 5 different flower beds that are devoted to different color themes. So for example, in my flower bed that is devoted to pink, white, and purple flowers, I've included prairie phlox, horse mint, and hairy beard tongue, which are all native plants that are very good for pollinators. You know, in my flower bed that's devoted to red, orange, and yellow flowers, I've included some butterfly milkweed and coreopsis, which are really great plants also for insects and pollinators. And also they're just beautiful plants. My husband has planted them around his orchard and vegetable gardens to be companion plants to support the predators that feed on garden pests. You know, so for example, there's this photo that he took of an assassin bug eating a caterpillar that was eating his green beans. And so planting those banks of native wildflowers around his garden helps increase in those very beneficial insects. In addition, you know, we've got a bunch of apple trees, cherry trees, all sorts of fruit trees, and increasing the bee population in the area also increases the amount of fruit that those trees produce. So just using them around your garden can really improve the yield of your garden, plus provide valuable habitat for the pollinators. And then of course, you can always plant a new garden. If you haven't been to the new Cadillac Manistee Ranger District office out in Wellston, this is what it looked like a year and a half ago as we started to plant new pollinator gardens around the building. And Dave, you probably remember that there used to be gardens there, but when they started to remodel that building for us to move into, they realized that the landscape was sloped toward the building. So there was water running into the building. So the gardens that I had planted there in 2009 needed to be bulldozed to reshape the land. And we transplanted most of those plants, but we were also able to plant new gardens. So I was very excited about that. And then you can kind of see where the edge of this garden is going to be. And the whole lawn, which is 1.5 acres, we are seeding with native grasses and wildflowers. And this is my office, my window right here. So as they were assigning seats, I made it very clear that the only thing I wanted was to actually overlook one of my gardens. So I'm very excited about all of that. Okay.
Carolyn?
Yeah.
What native grasses do you prefer for people who want to replace their lawns in an urban setting?
That is a very tricky question. So is this lawn that you want to keep short and keep mowing?
Well, I would ideally like to find a grass that doesn't grow so tall that you have to mow it. I mean, like 3 or 4 inches. I don't know if there's such a thing.
So I have talked to many of the different Michigan native plant producers, and they didn't have a good answer for me on that. Just because our recreation staff want something like that to plant on our rec sites. So I don't know of any native mixes, but some of the different native plant producers provide they call it a no-mow mix. It's a combination of fescues that are not invasive. They tend to, they're very graceful. They get to a certain height and they just kind of fold over. But if you go to their websites,
which website is that?
So here is the deal, Joe. In my official capacity in working for the Forest Service, I cannot recommend any particular businesses.
Okay.
So all I can recommend is that you would look for a native plant producer and check out their website.
Okay. Okay.
I'm sorry.
Fun.
And this is why I had to talk to our public affairs officer earlier today, just because I knew I was going to get that kind of a question.
Okay.
So.
And then native grasses are beneficial for pollinators, though.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So there are quite a few pollinators that, and actually I should say, butterflies, butterflies, moths, or skippers whose caterpillars will only eat the little blue stem or big blue stem or Indian grass or switchgrass.
Oh.
So they are very important for pollinators. However, when it comes to your gardens, I would limit how much you would plant in your gardens because those grasses can be fairly aggressive. So either you are going to have to be dedicated to transplanting them or ripping them out frequently. They'll take over your gardens otherwise. So, planting them out in this extended yard area is one thing, but to plant a lot of them in your garden isn't going to work. I did, and by I mean me and this group of volunteers that you see in this photo, we did plant some of the big and little blue stem around this back edge and around the front of the building. Just as demonstrations of native grasses, because I'm putting signs up explaining the ecology of this garden and the benefits of these native plants for pollinators and other ecosystem services. But it was one of those lessons learned with our office gardens from when our office was in Manistee that I was not dedicated to weeding them out of the garden, and they really did take over that garden. I was going to have to rip out quite a few, but then we moved offices. So they are very good to incorporate, but just using them very sparingly, I guess is what I'm trying to say. Okay. Any other questions at the moment? All right. So the first step in planting a new pollinator garden is to determine the growing conditions on your property. So, conventional wisdom kind of has it that you decide what you want to plant, and then you modify the growing conditions on your property in hopes that the plants will live and be healthy there. So you spend a lot of time watering, fertilizing, changing the pH of the soil, applying pesticides to try to keep those plants healthy that aren't adapted to growing in those conditions to begin with. And all of those activities have to be repeated through the life of those plants and are time, energy, and money consuming. It would be a lot less work, and you will end up with healthier plants and a healthier landscape if you first determine the growing conditions on your property and then choose plants that are appropriate for that situation. So the things that you need to think about are the soil type, the soil moisture, and the sunlight. You know, is your soil real sandy? Is it heavy clay, or is it something in the middle, like a loam, nice loam? Is it real sunny? Is it real shady? Is it a mix of the two? Are the soils really dry? Are they really wet? Or are they somewhere in the middle, that mesic stage? So this is a picture of our old office in Manistee before we pulled out all these shrubs and planted it to the native gardens. This site was incredibly sandy, sunny, and dry. And it would get very, very hot in these gardens. You can see that there is this road or a parking lot, and then a sidewalk, small strip of grass, the garden area, and then the side of the building. And this is the south side of the building, and the other garden is on the west side of the garden. So for this planting, and this is what I'm going to use as an example, just because these are the gardens that I have the best photos from. In putting this presentation together, because this is the first time I've been asked to talk about planting for pollinators, I realized that I am terrible at taking photos of my projects and my gardens. So this is the one that I have the best photos for. So this is what I'm going to use as my example. So, you know, in choosing your plants, you're going to choose the plants that are appropriate for your site. You should think about the heights of the plants and where you're going to plant them. You know, these windows at the office are fairly low. So I talked to my coworkers, and for the most part, we planted short things under the windows and planted those taller grasses, because big blue stem Indian grass can get to be, 6 or 7 feet tall. And so most of my coworkers did not want them in front of their windows, but there were a few people who did, just because they wanted a little more privacy. So that's one of those things to consider when you're planting, is do you want plants covering up your windows or not? If you are planting them adjacent to walkways, you probably want to put the shorter, more compact plants next to your walkways. Otherwise, they're going to grow and hang over your sidewalks and be kind of a pain in the neck. And then think about, do you want a more formal garden or more of a wild tangle of plants? You know, a lot of people have said that they are not interested in planting native plant gardens because they're ugly and messy and they don't like them. Well, it depends on what you want. You can make a very formal looking garden with native plants. You know, the garden at our new office is actually going to be a very formal garden. And then it's going to be backed by that wild tangle of plants, just to demonstrate how beautiful our native plants are and how they can be used in a very formal setting. And so if that's what you're looking for, talk to the plant nurseries, and they can give you great insights into what plants will do well in that more formal setting and which will do better in a wild tangle of plants. I personally like that wild tangle of plants just because there's a lot less weeding to do, and they require less water because those plants are holding more moisture close to the soil, and they're shading each other's roots. So it just depends on what you want. You should plan on at least 3 to 5 plants of each species, and grouping those together. So it really increases the pop or the visibility of the individual plants. It gives the caterpillars more to eat, and it makes the plants that the caterpillars are nibbling on less visible. So if you think about it, if you only have 1 or 2 of a particular species, like butterfly milkweed, and those are the only milkweeds in the area, then all of the monarch butterflies in the area, all of the tussock moth caterpillars or tussock moths in the area, and all the other insects that rely on milkweeds for a host plant are going to come and lay eggs on your 2 little milkweeds. And when those caterpillars hatch, the only thing that they can eat is milkweed, and there are only 2 of those plants. So they're going to strip all the leaves. It's not going to be enough to feed all those caterpillars, and those caterpillars are going to starve to death. So the more plants of each species that you can plant, the better. You know, if the option is to plant 1 of 30 species or 5 to 10 of 3 or 4 or 5 species, I would go with planting more plants of each species just to support the caterpillars. And then, of course, you want to confirm with the supplier that neither the seeds nor the plants have been treated with the neonicotinoids or the neonics that have been in the news so much lately. Because even if the seeds were treated with the neonics, it's a systemic insecticide. And as that plant or as that seed grows into a plant, the neonics are going to be in every part of that plant, including the nectar and pollen. So any insects that feed on that plant or the nectar or the pollen are going to die. And that will last for a full growing season. So that's definitely a question to ask the person that you're buying your plants from. Just, you know, it defeats the whole purpose of planting for pollinators if it's not going to support them, kill them instead. So, and then of course you want to select plants so that something will bloom from early spring until late fall. And preferably the goal is to have 3 species blooming at any given time. And the way I do this for my gardens is I actually plot it out. You know, this is an Excel spreadsheet where I just highlighted the months that these different species are expected to bloom in. So if you look down the columns, you can see that there are lots of species blooming at any given time. And so even into September and October, it's important to have those species that will be blooming just to support the monarchs as they are migrating. Excuse me. And there are actually lots of other insects or butterflies that are migrating at the same time. So having those late season plants blooming is pretty important. And once again, you can go to that Michigan Native Plant Producers Association website to find out when different species are expected to bloom. And their website is mnppa.net. Okay.
Carolyn,
So
Carolyn, could you repeat that again, please?
So it's the Michigan Native Plant Producers Association website. So it's mnppa.net.
mncca.net. Okay.
Actually, it's PP as in plant producers.
Oh,
So
MPP. Okay.
Michigan Native Plant Producers Association. So it's the first letter of all of those words, mnppa.net.
Okay. Thank you.
And they have lots of really good information on their website. Okay. So what if you want to provide habitat for specific butterflies, moths, or skippers? Say that you have, you know, a certain butterfly that you just love, or a certain moth that you just think is the best thing ever. Or I personally love these silver spotted skippers. So what do you need to know to plant for them? Well, you need to find out what their host plant is, as in what will the caterpillars need to survive, and what is their preferred nectar plant or plants. And remember that the adults do tend to be fairly generalists when they are looking for nectar and pollen, but they still have some preferred species as well. So the best website that I've found for that is this Butterflies and Moths of North America website. So, and that's just butterfliesandmoths.org. And one of the things that you can also do with that website is to make sure that those species are actually in your area and are likely to visit your property. Otherwise, you might be pretty disappointed if they never appear. So for example, I really like Karner blue butterflies. They're a federally endangered species, but it doesn't matter how much lupin I plant on my property, they're not going to be there in the next 10 years, you know, just because their range is so limited. So when you go to that Butterflies and Moths of North America website, you can look up individual species. So for example, I just happen to pull up the page for the question mark butterfly because I think they're really cool. And there's all sorts of good information on identification and their life history, their flight time. So when they're expected to be around and flying around. So, you know, this tells you that the overwintered adults fly and lay eggs in the spring until the end of May. But I didn't realize that this was another butterfly that migrated until I pulled up their website while I was making this presentation. So when they come back, the summer form emerges and flies later in the summer and also laying eggs that will overwinter there. So their host plants are American elm, red elm, hackberry, Japanese hop, which is actually an invasive species, nettles, and false nettle. Now, I love pollinators, and I really like question mark butterflies, but I personally am not going to plant stinging nettles in my flower beds. However, I might try to plant an elm or a hackberry. And then the adult food is rotting fruit, tree sap, dung, and carrion. And only when these are unavailable do they visit flowers. So, you know, this might not be a butterfly that you deliberately try to attract to your property, unless, of course, you know, it happens to be your favorite. And you can do things like put out rotten fruit for it. But you can look up hundreds of species of butterflies and moths and skippers on this website and find out that kind of information from them or about them. And they have these great maps. So you can see where they are likely to be in the country as well as in the state of Michigan. Okay. But just in general, so plants for butterflies. Butterflies like to have flowers that have lots of little tiny flowers clustered together that they can land on and walk around on fairly easily. So the different cone flowers, lots of different asters, the goldenrods, the yarrow that's in the next picture here, etc. So moths tend to prefer these white flowers.
Yeah.
They need flowers that are going to be open at night. You know, some flowers like the onethras, the primroses, close up at night. So those aren't going to be as valuable for those night flying moths. Bumblebees like these tubular flowers, and they really, really like these hairy beard tongue flowers. You know, having those tubular flowers makes it difficult for other pollinators to get in there, get the nectar and pollen. So it's great for those bees that can get inside there and do that buzz pollination. So how many plants will you need? So with spacing, you know, think about how large the plants will be when they are mature. You know, most plants you can plant about 1 plant per square foot, or about 1 foot apart. So things like the black-eyed Susans, the bee balm, horsemint, coreopsis, et cetera, et cetera. You know, with the smaller plants like the wild geranium, the lupins, the golden ragworts, the harebell. And harebell gets to be pretty tall, but it's a very narrow plant. So I tend to plant those about 6 inches apart. And then the large plants, the big blue stem, the little blue stem, showy goldenrods can be 2 to 3 feet apart. And so you would just calculate out the area and then the number of plants that you need. Okay, so planting plants closer together like that will reduce the space available for weeds, so you won't have to spend quite as much time weeding. They maintain the humidity levels around the plants and decrease evaporation from the soil, so they'll be less stressed in regard to water. It decreases the distance that the pollinators need to travel between plants, and then also the distance the caterpillars need to travel as they move from plant to plant. Of course, it lets you plant more plants initially. Planting the plants further apart will allow for more air circulation around the plants, so reducing the risk of mildews and other diseases. It'll look more like a formal garden. It'll be less expensive, and it will allow space for those new plants to germinate the following spring. So the decision is up to you if you want really close, dense plantings or plantings that are spread out a little bit more. So with the office planting in Manistee, because that is such a hot, dry, sandy site, we planted the plants pretty closely together. Because the planting at the new office is more of a formal garden, they're planted much further apart just to have that different appearance. Okay, finally getting on to the planting. So good site preparation is essential to the success of your planting. You really do need that bare soil. You know, if you're thinking that you can just go out into your lawn and dig some small holes and put some of the native plants in, it might not work all that well, just because the grass, the lawn, already has its root system established. So the grass can absorb water and nutrients faster than those native plants can until they get their root system established. Mm-hmm. So you really do need to have a good bare dirt situation. Okay, so that is the Manistee office in 2010. We have our gardens sites prepared, lots of bare soil there. You can see all of our flats of plants because we planted, you know, each of these flats has 38 plants in it. And granted, these are very large gardens. Each one was about 900 square feet. So we planted lots and lots of plants, which is why I had lots of volunteers. So when I'm planning out a garden, I actually go through and use flags with the names of the plants written on them, so I can physically see where all of the plants are going to go. And because these plants are large and I'm working with volunteers, I actually write the name of the plant, the spacing, and then the number of plants that are supposed to be planted around each of these flags. And Dave, I think you were there and helping. I was looking for photos of you to use in here, but I didn't find any. Sorry. I know I've seen them, but I couldn't find them. So this is the system whenever I use for using those large gardens, because especially with working with volunteers, they can't read my mind. I don't know why, but they can't read my mind and figure out where I want everything planted. So I found that it's really a nice system. And even for my flower beds at home, when I'm planning out a new flower bed, I like to put those flags just so I can get a good visual of how many plants I have and where they all need to go. So with that really sandy soil, they recommend making a slight bowl so that any of the water is funneled down toward the roots of your plants. And then one of the things that we found is that some of the plants are kind of root bound. So it's when the roots start to wrap around each other, and you just kind of make a cut on each side of that plant and then at the bottom, and then peel the roots up a little bit just so that they start to spread out and into the soil. Otherwise, they'll just keep wrapping around each other and the plants will be more susceptible to diseases, drought, stressors, and usually ends up dying. So, and in general, I like to plant much taller plants in the back row and then the shorter plants in the front, just so that all of the plants can get good sunlight, good sun exposure, and also so you can see all of your plants. And that's just kind of a standard gardening practice. So this is the garden after all of the plants are planted. That just makes me so happy to see it. And then this is the next summer. And you can see all those nice, wonderful plants growing. It ended up being it was a beautiful garden, much better than those shrubs that didn't really provide any habitat for any of the insects. And just, it was beautiful. It was really pleased with how it came out. Yes.
Carolyn, this is Joe again.
Yep.
What is your thoughts on, you mentioned clearing the grass, you know, they're not going to do good where you have established lawn or something. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on using an herbicide to remove the grass? And lastly, I want to ask everybody to go to the bottom of their screen. On the bottom left, there's a mute button. Make sure that you're muted unless you're talking, because we can hear some background noise once in a while. Anyway, back to the question, Carolyn.
Okay, so it's going to depend a lot on the size of your garden. So, and how many helpers you have and how much effort you want to put into it. So with these gardens, you know, we ripped out the shrubs and physically removed the sod. And with my home gardens, I physically removed the sod. With the, and of course, there are the options of solarizing the grass also, where you would put down black plastic over it and stake it down really well to try to kill off the grass. If it's not really hot and sunny out though, it's not going to be a complete kill, I found in different situations. With the gardens out at the new office in Wellston, we did actually use herbicide because a lot of the plants were spotted knapweed, horiolisum, and other invasives. And just because it was such a large system. And when I planted those first gardens there in 2009, we did try to remove the sod. And unfortunately, the root systems went deeper than anticipated, and a lot of the grass came back, and it was a battle for years afterwards. So that's why I decided that with the gardens this time that we were just going to herbicide. So you have to read the label of the herbicide that you want to use. The label is the law, so you need to make sure to follow all of the directions in it. And then you need to, depending on which herbicide you use, and as I said, you need to read the label for it, but it takes about 2 weeks before you can plant plants in that site. So, you know, I know there's a lot of controversy when it comes to herbicide, and especially you need to use it carefully so it doesn't impact the pollinators. In that case, what we were killing was just lawn grass, so it's not useful for pollinators anyway. And in the balance, it seemed like planting those pollinator gardens would be more advantageous in the long run. So that's one of those decisions that everyone's going to have to make for themselves. Did that answer your question, Joe?
Yes, I would then have to put some thought into, do some of the herbicides have neonics in them?
So neonic, or the neonicotinoids, are an insecticide. So herbicides
are all right, yeah, okay.
Plants.
Yeah, I get you now. All right. I'm just thinking of, like, you know, Roundup and stuff like that. Is that an absolute no-no, Roundup?
So the active ingredient in Roundup is called glyphosate, and that's what that's actually the herbicide that I use the most. Just because we do a lot of invasive plant treatment as well. And we try to use as little herbicide as we possibly can. And we try to use it as responsibly as we can. And when it comes to controlling invasives, the method that we use the most is a cut stump treatment. So you're basically cutting down the tree, shrub, or vine, and then just dabbing it on the stump. For some of those invasives, it's nearly impossible to control them without some herbicide.
Mm-hmm.
So the fact that we're trying to minimize any overspray, we're not injuring any of the plants next to it. We're really truly just, it's what we use, it's a bottle with a sponge at the tip. So we're just dabbing it on. So the amount we're using is pretty minuscule. And in the long run, eliminating those invasive plants and giving the native plants a chance to survive in that site outweighs the potential damage of that herbicide. You know, with preparing the ground for a garden, and especially a native plant garden or pollinator garden, in the grand scheme of things, we're not using that much herbicide. And it's for a very short period of time, you know, and then we're planting it.
Okay.
So, you know, I guess those are the conversations that I have in my head as I'm trying to decide if we're going to use herbicide or not use herbicide. You have more questions about that, or?
I had a question, or I just want to say that you can contact SISMA to eliminate some of your invasive plants first, and they will, you can have funded a portion of your removal. And I think people have, like in their own private properties, problems with invasives that they could target, let's say, not knapweed or something else that might be a problem, multiflora rose, and then replace it with the native pollinators. So that SISMA, you can contact them. They're online and find them pretty easily, and they'll come out and look at your site and give you recommendations.
That's a really good suggestion. And that organization is called North Country Cooperative Invasive Species Management Area. So I sit on the steering committee for that group. So thank you very much for bringing that up. And they are, you know, they have a limited staff, so they won't be able to treat every invasive, but the high priority ones, you know, the Oriental bittersweet, the Japanese knotweed, buckthorn, garlic mustard, things of that nature. So, but they can also help you by coming out and identifying what you have and helping you figure out what to do with it. So it's a great group. They're a very good group of people. So, okay. So you can see that there are the clusters of plants in different places. So it really helps to make that color apparent in those gardens. You know, so we planted things like that hairy beard tongue that the bumblebees love. There's lots of that coreopsis. This little purple plant back here that you see is harebell. And there are multiple species blooming at the same time. So this is the garden on the other side of the building. You can see the black-eyed Susans here, the bee balm, the butterfly milkweed. There's some more harebell here. Then closer to the door is where I planted the wild geranium and the shorter plants. So once again, just showing that there are different species blooming at the same time. There's more of the harebell, the bee balm, the butterfly milkweed, the smooth blue aster is starting to grow here. We planted the big blue stem in the back, and you can see that it will be in between the windows. There's some little blue stem up front. Oh, and one of the things that I was going to mention in that first in this photo, you can see that I did not put down any wood chips in this garden. And I did that for a few reasons. You know, this area or this garden actually has a sprinkler system. So water stress wasn't going to be as bad in the site just because we could set the sprinklers on a timer and water it on a regular basis. But the other reason is because if you put down a layer of wood chips, there are a lot of bee species that nest underground. There are lots of the moths and caterpillars, or I'm sorry, moths and butterflies and skippers that pupate underground, and they can't get through a thick layer of wood chips. And since this is a pollinator garden, we did not put down any wood chips just because it would interfere with those processes. With the garden out at the new office, because there isn't a sprinkler system and because it is a more formal looking garden, we did put down wood chips, but there are acres of native grasses and wildflowers surrounding that building, and we're converting that lawn into native grasses and wildflowers also. So there are plenty of sites for the bees to nest underground and for the caterpillars to pupate underground. Let's see. And I just wanted to highlight a few of the species like the butterfly milkweed. And that is one that the monarch caterpillars can feed on. And it just has such beautiful orange flowers. We also included black-eyed Susans and purple coneflowers in this planting, just because those are two species that people with gardens are familiar with. So it would make them more comfortable with this kind of a planting. So I love this bee balm. It's in the mint family, so it has that square stem that's typical of the mint. And the butterflies and bees just love it. My coworkers were very excited that first summer, especially because the goldfinches would come right up to their windows to feed on the seeds of the golden ragwort and the beard tongues and the different coneflowers. And so it's just pretty cool to look out our office windows and see those birds close up. And the butterflies really like this garden also. The blazing star is another one of my favorite plants. And then this grass that's next to it on this side is Indian grass. And the grass on the other side of it is big blue stem. And then there were the skippers, as I mentioned. The silver spotted skippers are one of my favorite little skippers. And it is enjoying the flowers of a flat-topped aster. And so there's another one of the silver spotted skippers on this goldenrod. And I just wanted to make everyone aware that goldenrods are not what causes people's allergies. So people tend to see those nice showy yellow flowers at the same time that their allergies get bad late summer and fall, and think that that is what is causing their allergy issues. What is actually causing their allergy issues is ragweed and some of the annual or non-native grasses that are blooming at the same time. These plants that have really showy flowers are trying to attract pollinators. And the pollen tends to be sticky so that it sticks to the insects and they carry it with them from flower to flower to flower. Plants that have those small green or brown flowers tend to be wind pollinated, like the ragweed. And that pollen is designed to get into the air, and that is what causes our allergy issues. So a lot of people seem to be concerned that these native plants cause allergy issues, but that's not really the case. And then I was excited that these blinded Sphinx moths were appearing around our garden, and it's on a leaf of a goldenrod. So the adults actually, are unable to eat, but the caterpillars eat a lot of the different broadleaf plants. And so they were also using our gardens. And so I thought it was interesting that this is one of those species that is considered to have regional preferences as far as the caterpillars. So in different areas of the country, they're feeding on different species of plants, which shows that adaptation to the different toxins in plants can be kind of localized, which I thought was very interesting. Okay. So of course, these gardens do require maintenance, just like any other garden, especially for the first few years. You're going to have to weed them, water them, do some transplanting, because these plants will seed in. And so you can transplant the seedlings to other areas or other gardens. And of course, you want to avoid using pesticides or insecticides, because if you want the pollinators, you're going to need the caterpillars and the bite marks on the, or chew marks on the leaves that come with that. You know, I kind of see that as, this is awesome. Something else is actually using my gardens. They're serving a role in the ecology of the area. And then I tend to leave the stems through the winter, just because they're overwintering sites for bees. They have seeds that the birds will eat throughout the fall and winter, and will germinate in spring if any are left. I think a lot of the plants are really beautiful over winter. And then, I was going to say, with that office planting in Manistee, that that sprinkler system worked really well for the first couple of years, and then didn't work so well. So instead of putting wood chip mulch down, what we would do is in the spring, we would actually cut up the dead plants and use those for mulch around the plants. And it worked really well. And then there are lots and lots of free resources on the internet to help with designing and planting your native plant garden. Because as you design your own and you plant your own, you're probably going to come up with lots and lots of different questions. And these would be good guides to help. So one is actually published by the Michigan Audubon Society, Michigan Native Garden Design for the birds, but the principles and the recommendations would also be very good for pollinators. Oops. And let's see, I don't know if I can copy those websites into the chat when I'm done with this presentation. But if you just search for that Michigan Native Garden Design from the Audubon Society, you should be able to pull that up, because that's a really long website address. And then I discovered this pretty cool little booklet, Native Plants for the Small Yard, on the, and I don't know how to pronounce that, the name of that nature center, but the Lehigh Gap Nature Center in Pennsylvania. And one of the nice things is it has plans for all sorts of different kinds of gardens. And it goes into detail about how many plants of each species you need, et cetera, et cetera. One word of caution is, if you are using one of these guides from another state, is that you might need to substitute species, because they have a lot of species mentioned in their book that are not native to Michigan. But it would be easy to substitute in different species that are in fact native to Michigan. And then there's the Wild Ones Native Garden Designs website. So the Wild Ones are devoted to landscaping with native plants. They have lots and lots of good information on their website, as well as plans for gardens. And then they have these nice step-by-step instructions, how to create your garden plan, how to install your gardens, the maintenance, and then the garden designs. And just a hint, if you go to look for the Wild Ones website, make sure to type in Wild Ones native plants. Otherwise, you're going to get results you don't want to see. So do you have any questions?
That was really good, Carolyn.
Oh, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
Yeah, I don't have any more questions. I don't know if anybody else does. Well, I'm going to have to plan a visit to your new building.
And I did include my email address. Right now, I'm still, and it's just carolyn.henne@usda.gov. And that's U.S. Department of Agriculture.
Do you
oops.
Do you do consultations for homeowners?
I do not.
Okay.
There are lots of people who do consulting work for native gardens and lots of other resources. As a federal employee, my responsibility is to work on national forest land. You can ask me questions, but I can't come out to your house and make recommendations and things of that nature.
Okay.
But you're more than welcome to come and ask questions or email me questions. The reason I did not include a phone number is because for the moment I am mostly teleworking, and I am not good at calling into my office phone to see if there are any messages for me. So the best way to get hold of me at the moment is to send me an email.
Okay.
Carolyn, that very last flower you've got up on the screen now, what's the name of that one? I know you had it before.
It's called Blazing Star.
Okay, thanks.
And it's one of my favorites. I just love it.
Yeah.
It almost looks like a thistle.
They are in the same family, but Blazing Star has no thorns. Or no.
I was gonna say, if you go on the Lehigh Gap Nature Center website, I was there 2 summers ago because I started the Appalachian Trail there, and I was there for a few hours. But if you look at their website, they have like landscaping resources for communities and wildlife, and they have some demonstration gardens there. So it's a long. Obviously, we're not going to go there, but they've been doing this for a long time because that was the site of an old mine, and there's a lot of mine tailings that they had to revegetate the whole area. And so that's why they've got so much experience in growing native plants. So they're very helpful if you talk to them, and they had a library. It was really a really interesting place to go to. It's out by the town of Jim Thorpe, if you ever heard of that, but it's in kind of eastern Pennsylvania.
Great.
On the Appalachian Trail.
Sounds like a good trip.
Yeah. But they have a lot of garden design information and publications that they'll, including some of the ones you mentioned. So that's why I thought of them. Yep.
Yeah, they did seem to have a really good website with lots of good resources. So that's really cool that you got to see that also.
Yeah, it just happened to be where we picked because we needed a place to park, and they had a big public parking area, but that's where we started. And then I had to wait for a friend 3 or 4 hours. So I was there a long time and just hung out and realized what kind of resources they had. So it was, if you look at their website, you'd be impressed, I think.
I was impressed.
Here,
Right.
Well, if nobody has any further questions, let's let Carolyn go home and back to her family. And thank you so much, Carolyn, for this wonderful presentation. This is really a treat.
Well, thank you. And thank you for the invitation to speak with your group. It was nice to see everybody.
Yeah, it's wonderful to see you as well. And thanks everybody else for tuning in. And we'll